I only had 2 points to make before I came here, and they've already been made by other people. So I'm just going to have to vamp out the rest of the panel. But I will say something about that function that a critic has of connecting books to the rest of the culture. The longer I work as a critic, the less I think the critic's job is to pass judgment on works of literature and say whether they are good or bad. The practice of reviewing books evolved in a time when opinions about whether books were good or crap were a scarce commodity. Now we live in an age where opinions about whether books are good or crap, we have, if anything, a surplus of them. It is very easy to go and find people saying this sucks or this rocks. I feel as though that changes a little bit the role of the critic, and it makes it more their job not to say, hey, I like this book, because the critic's, an individual critic's opinion has come to weigh less and less. And more I feel like it's my job to do other things, to place books in context in a way that will enrich people's reading experience of them, rather than to say whether they're good or bad. And that's what I think I was trying to. I recently wrote a cover story for Time about Jonathan Franzen. And in a funny way, I didn't actually want to review that book. I wrote, it was a profile of Franzen more than it was a review of his book. And I kind of tried to, I almost wanted to skate around passing judgment on it, and was more interested in the task of drawing lines between it and books that had come before it.
And do you think that that is across the board? It sounds like you're saying across the board. Do you think that that's an important role for the critic, to draw those kinds of lines in parallel?
Well, you know what? Again, I feel like the job of the critic, as much as I used to read reviews, and what I would do would be to just skim and see where the book's title appeared in the second paragraph, because that is generally where the critic tips his or her hand. Little amusing personal anecdote to lead off with, second paragraph, and you know, so and so stunning, so and so's unbelievably crappy book. Usually, you get it in the second paragraph. Little insider tip. But I'm no longer interested really in doing that. Suddenly the question of what X thinks, whether X thinks a book is good or bad, has that question, the answer to it has kind of, the interest of it has been leached away, even if X equals myself. What I'm more interested in reading is a critic like James Wood, who is the critic for the New Yorker. More than anything else, what he's doing is letting the reader of his reviews inside that little secret dyad that forms between James Wood and a book. And what he does is allow you to watch him reading and give you a sense of what gears turn in his head while he's reading. After I'm done reading a James Wood review, I am a better reader than when I started. And you know, reading somebody who enriches my reading experience, that's really more what I'm after from a review than this or that.
Mm-hmm. But you can get this or that on a website like that so fast. But I think you're right about context. I mean, I think about the books we're reading today, some of them are translations, some of them are written by brand new writers like Tiffany Yannick, who's coming from a world that some people may not know about. And I find often putting a book in the context of its origins. Some of the reviews I do are about people who are from other countries who are writing in English for Americans, or they're recently published, and people may not understand even the area they're from. Like Chimamanda Adichie, when she first began to publish in the United States, she's a Nigerian writer who's just magnificent. And has won a lot of awards. So when she began to first appear in America, go on book tours, people couldn't pronounce her name and they didn't know quite where she was coming from and so forth. So I've always found it very helpful to be able to offer some kind of a contextual understanding of people who are coming from other cultures who are writing fiction that Americans are looking at for the first time. Mm-hmm. Or, you know, just for me the joy is coming up with a writer who's full into a career and putting context to the books that they've done before and the books they've done now. I mean, the first review I did, and it was right after my story collection came out, was a review of an Alice Munro collection. And I was sitting around one day and I thought, this is a gorgeous collection, and I'm really tired of people calling Alice Munro a regional writer because she lives in Canada. Wallace Stegner's not considered a regional writer, although he writes about Canada, and I started thinking about it. And so I suggested to the editor of the Los Angeles Times, I'd like to review this book. And the more I thought about it, the more fun I had reading back to her early work and thinking about, you know, what she was doing, and really watching her as a writer write about the numinous and write about a small town and write all of the details. And I had so much fun studying the craft of her early work and then her middle stories and then what she was doing now, that it was a great pleasure for me. And that's why I really started building that kind of dual life of including reviewing while writing fiction.
Mm-hmm. But I'd like to go back to you about that, Roxanne, and go back to the Philip Roth review, because setting the context, letting the person reading the criticism in on that relationship between the critic and the writer as they read, all of that I think is important and terribly valuable. But what about just straight, full-on critique, especially of a writer who has stature and impact in America, as Philip Roth does? I mean, what about that?
Oddly enough, I too feel a license to say that Roth is crap. And I say that about very few other writers, but for some reason, it seems okay.
But why does it seem okay?
I guess just because, he is so extremely well established, and he has written such, really almost unassailable masterpieces, and also because his late novels are so crap. And, people, they've got a little bit, they get a lot of attention that they don't deserve.
There's this hushed reverence.
Reverence.
That he gets, which I just thought, I can't, if I'm asked to review this book, I'm not going to continue this tradition of hushed reverence when I see his name on the title page. This is not a great book for lots of reasons, so.
Great writers write terrible books,
Yeah.
you know.
But do you ever worry as fiction writers yourself that the person reading the criticism, reading the review is going to say, well, this writer is writing so differently than Lev Grossman or than Roxana Robinson, and therefore, of course, they don't like the book because they have a bias toward the kind of writing they themselves write. Do you ever worry about that?
That's why we're asked to review. I mean, because we have a point of view, because we write. That's, I mean, I think
But
there's...
isn't it also
I actually
because
disagree.
you need to get to the intrinsic value of the book, whether it's the kind of writing that you might do or not? I mean,
Having come out as a writer of fiction really changed who I was as a critic in a way that I can sort of never go back to, because it is true. You show your hand. You try to be that critic who approaches every book on its own terms, tries to get a sense of what they're trying to do and whether they achieve it, and bring a different appropriate set of standards to each book. That you're done. You can't pretend that anymore. It's terrible, and it's really it makes me wonder how much longer I can keep reviewing, because it is clear that there is a fixed set of standards that in fact I bring to books, and I can't run away from that forever.
Yeah, I mean, if you write, it's desperately important to you to write the kind of fiction that you respect. And so if you see somebody else writing fiction that you don't respect, and you see that person getting the Nobel Prize, you are saying, at least I will raise my voice and say, for my money, this book is not great. Because you put so much into your own work. But I still wouldn't do it with somebody who would be devastated. I wouldn't do it, as I say. I would often pass the book off, just saying, I'm not the right person to review this.
I've gotten out of that. I don't write hatchet jobs anymore. I used to, but I've gotten out of that business.
There's so there's so little space for reviews anymore. It really is a hard thing to do. I mean, I think that dead silence is probably the equivalent of the hatchet job. No reviews. It's rare to see a real negative for an early book.
do you feel do you treat a review that you're writing for print in the same way that you treat a review that you're writing for an online publication, or do you spend different amounts of time, different kinds of, or have different kinds of approaches to them?
I only review for print.
You only review
for the
for
Times
print.
and for the Washington.
Doesn't make any difference to me. It's how long is it going to be?
Mhm.
I mean, it can be 2,000 words, it can be 700 words, it could be 500 words, it could be 300 words. Doesn't make a difference where it's going to end up. It's still going through the process, and I spend about as much time on even the smaller, the NPR reviews I write are 500 words or so, and that's not easy. There's a real spaciousness and leisure to writing a 2,000 word piece that includes all somebody's prior work and some references to things that you think they're up to. It's easier to do that. So it's not the technology doesn't matter. It's
Does
more
it
like
matter to you, Ed?
Not a huge amount. I mean, I guess I'm a lot looser online. I use even more profanity than I use in print. There's a funny dynamic online whereby there are no space limitations because you're not printing on paper. So you can write much longer. On the other hand, people tend to have a shorter attention span online, so you have to write much shorter. You're sort of pulled in those two directions, and generally I end up writing short. I write a blog post because that seems to be the optimal unit of content online.
And I wonder, how do you all feel about your responsibility to sort of shape American fiction through the criticism that you do? In other words, shape the critical discussion, the larger critical discussion. John Updike was pretty keen on that, shaping the larger critical discussion and setting out the ways that people ought to review other people's books, and also just trying to I think he was quite a good critic and someone who cared about the kind of ongoing literary discussion that was happening. Do you feel a responsibility toward that as you review, or are you just very focused particularly on the book that you're reviewing?
I like the idea of being part of a large discussion, a larger conversation that takes place about literature. And reviewing a book that has nothing to do with my writing is always interesting. So, it will make me think the way this other person thinks about writing. So I like being part of that. I also think, as I did with the Philip Roth book, that you can find moments in which you say, this is what I value about writing, this is important to me, and this is where this book veers off the track, or this is where this book succeeds in the manner of fiction that I find the most important and the most valuable. So I think we're all part of it.
I mean, I don't really believe that I have much power to, steer a national conversation about fiction, but I like to pretend that I do. And I think about that a lot. I mean, one of the things I've done at Time, for example, as well as literary fiction, I quite enjoy genre fiction. Time magazine did not used to review genre fiction. They used not to review fantasy or science fiction or thrillers or detective fiction. And one of the things that I've tried to do is take those books and say, hey, these books are important, people love them, but also, and they mean something, they're worthy of serious discussion. So, in a small way, I felt like I waged a little war to broaden the width, what do you broaden? To make the sort of field of literary criticism and the field of the conversation a little bit wider.
Yeah. And Jane?
I like to be part of the conversation. I think the conversation is incredibly important. I also think about, there are times when I think about the time I take away from fiction writing to do reviewing. And at a certain point, a couple of years ago, I was at a writer's colony and I had an editor give me an assignment, and I was torn because I was there to work on fiction. And I read a little bit about Virginia Woolf, who at a certain point in her life decided that she would keep the reviewing and the novel going side by side at the same time. And I thought, you know, that is such a common thing. Virginia Woolf, Cynthia Ozick, these writers today, Catherine Harrison, there are so many writers who are doing both the reviewing and the fiction writing that it is a path that I find very honorable.